The Empire thought it had won, but humanity smiled and said not even close. I was running when the sky turned white, not jogging, not hurrying, running for my life through the burning streets of Geneva with a stolen Dominion data chip in my pocket and 3 patrol drones closing in behind me. The air tasted like smoke and copper and the end of everything we had ever known. My boots hit broken glass with every step, and the only thought in my head was a single, desperate prayer that the information on that chip was worth the 4 people I had just lost getting it. My name is Elise Vargan. I used to be a NATO intelligence officer. That was before the Valith Dominion arrived and turned every title, every rank, every flag on Earth into a joke. Now I am something simpler. I am a member of the human resistance, and I am alive, which on most days is the only victory I can claim. Let me take you back 6 weeks. That is all it took, 6 weeks for the largest interstellar empire in known space to bring humanity to its knees. The Valith Dominion controlled over 400 star systems. They had conquered dozens of species across thousands of years. Their warships ran on energy sources our best physicists could not even name, let alone understand. When their fleet appeared above Earth, 37 capital ships arranging themselves in orbit like a crown of iron, the world held its breath and waited for a conversation. What we got instead was a demand. The Dominion transmitted what they called the Instrument of Submission. It was simple. Humanity would be reclassified as a servitor species. We would mine our own planet for the Empire's benefit. Our governments would be dissolved. Our armies would be disbanded. Our children would be educated in Dominion doctrine. In exchange, we would be allowed to continue existing. The UN Security Council told them no. I remember watching the broadcast from a military bunker outside Brussels. The Secretary General, George Whitfield, stood at a podium and delivered the refusal with a steady voice. He said that humanity would not kneel. He said that if the Dominion wanted Earth, they would have to take it. I remember thinking he was either the bravest man alive or the most foolish. It turned out to be both. The Dominion expected the war to last 3 days. Their military doctrine said so. Every simulation, every historical precedent, every conquered species in their long and bloody history told them the same thing. 3 days. Destroy the command centers, neutralize the military leadership, broadcast the terms again, and watch the survivors line up to comply. It took them 6 weeks, and it cost them 11 warships. 11. In 10,000 years of conquest, no species had ever managed to destroy more than 2. Humanity took out 11 before we fell, and we did it with nuclear submarines, with modified satellite systems, with a courage so fierce and so reckless that the Dominion admirals wrote confused reports about it for months afterward. We fought with everything we had, from aircraft carriers to improvised explosive devices built by farmers in Iowa. We fought like people who understood exactly what they were losing. But we lost. The cities fell one by one: New York, London, Beijing, Mumbai, Berlin. The Dominion's orbital strikes turned skylines into craters. Their ground forces moved through our defenses like water through paper. By the end of the 6th week, every major military installation on Earth was either destroyed or captured, and the leaders who had not been captured were in hiding or pretending to be dead. On a cold Tuesday morning in October, Secretary General Whitfield stood before a Dominion camera and read the formal surrender. His voice did not shake. His eyes did not waver. He told the world that it was over, that the fighting would stop, that humanity would comply. I watched that broadcast from a basement in London. I watched it with 57 other people who had been chosen for a very specific reason. And when Whitfield finished speaking and the screen went dark, the woman next to me, a retired schoolteacher named Sophie Langford who had once taught geography and now built signal jammers out of old mobile phones, turned to me and said, "That was quite convincing, was it not?" I nodded. It was convincing. It was meant to be. Because the surrender was a performance, and every word of it was a lie. Project Ember had been activated in the 2nd week of the war, when it became clear that conventional victory was impossible. The idea was not complicated, but it required the kind of long-term thinking that the Dominion had never encountered before. The plan was simple: lose the war, surrender publicly, let the Dominion believe they had won, and then, from the ashes of a conquered planet, begin the real fight. Thousands of operatives across every continent received their orders through channels the Dominion could not detect. military personnel, intelligence officers, engineers, scientists, hackers, and ordinary civilians who simply refused to accept the outcome. We melted into the cracks. We disappeared into abandoned subway tunnels and forgotten bunkers and basement laboratories and mountain caves. We took everything we could carry: weapons, tools, data, medical supplies, and we vanished so completely that the Dominion scanners could not find a trace of us. The Empire declared Earth pacified. Emperor Zareth Cole IV broadcast a galaxy-wide message announcing that the human threat had been eliminated. Allied species sent polite condolences. Mining contracts were drawn up. Resource extraction schedules were planned. Earth was filed away as another successful conquest in the Dominion's long and tedious history of crushing everyone who ever said no to them. And that was their first mistake. I will tell you about my cell. That is what we called our units, cells, small enough to hide, large enough to matter. I ran Cell 7, operating out of a network of maintenance tunnels beneath the London Underground. My people were 62 souls drawn from every walk of life you could imagine. Daniel Perry was a retired librarian from Leeds who happened to have spent 20 years in the Royal Engineers before switching careers. He could build a signal disruptor from a car battery and a kitchen timer, and he quoted poetry while he did it. Oliver Grant was a mechanical engineer from Edinburgh who had been working on North Sea oil rigs when the invasion started. He had hands like dinner plates and a mind that could look at a piece of alien technology and understand its engineering principles within an hour. And then there was Priya Kapoor, 16 years old, born in Coventry, daughter of 2 software engineers, quiet and fierce, and absolutely brilliant. She cracked Dominion encryption in 9 days. When I asked her how, she looked at me like I had asked a stupid question and said it was just pattern recognition, like the puzzle games she used to play on her phone before the invasion. That girl saw mathematics the way most people see colors, effortlessly and in all directions. We lived underground. We ate rations that tasted like cardboard. We slept in shifts on thin mattresses laid across tunnel platforms, and every single day, we worked. We intercepted Dominion communications. We mapped patrol routes. We studied their technology. We built tools and weapons from salvaged parts and sheer determination, and we waited. Above us, the Dominion went about the business of ruling a conquered planet, and they did it the same way they had always done it. They installed a sector governor. They set up administrative centers. They began cataloging Earth's resources for extraction. They established patrol routes and security checkpoints, and propaganda broadcast stations that transmitted messages in every human language, telling us how fortunate we were to be part of the glorious Valith Dominion. They did everything by the book. The problem was that they only had one book, and it had been written for species that behaved predictably. Here is what the Dominion never understood about humanity, the thing that made us different from every other civilization they had ever conquered. Every other species in the galaxy had a structure, a hierarchy, a central command. The Filarathi had their trade council, the Rithani had their collective mind, the Ul-Kavari had their elder parliament. In every case, the pattern was the same: conquer the leadership, and the rest follows. Cut the head off the animal, and the body stops moving. Humanity did not work that way. We had never worked that way. We were 7 billion people who could not agree on anything. Not politics, not religion, not even whether a tomato was a fruit or a vegetable. We had spent our entire history arguing with each other, splitting into factions, forming new alliances, breaking old ones, and somehow stumbling forward through sheer collective stubbornness. The Dominion saw this chaos and called it weakness. They thought our inability to unify was a flaw. They could not have been more wrong, because you cannot decapitate something that has no single head. You cannot break a chain of command that does not exist. You cannot force a species to surrender when that species is made up of billions of individuals, each one of whom is fully capable of looking at impossible odds and saying, no. 3 months after the surrender, I found the message that changed everything. I was sorting through intercepted Dominion communications when I came across a classified dispatch from the sector governor to Dominion Central Command. It was a routine status report, the kind of thing that gets filed and forgotten, but one line caught my eye. It read, "Pacification of Earth, complete. Recommend resource extraction begin on standard timeline." I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully and tucked it into the pocket of my vest. I kept it there for the next year, a small rectangle of alien paper that became my favorite joke in the universe. That night, I sat in my tunnel beneath London, surrounded by 62 people who had given up everything they had ever known to fight an empire that controlled the stars, and I wrote in my journal the first honest thing I had felt since the war began. They think they have won. That is the funniest thing I have read all year. 3 months into the occupation, and the Dominion was starting to get confused. I could see it in their communications. Every intercepted message carried a slightly sharper tone than the one before. The sector governor, a towering Valith official named Dreth Soran, who had pacified 6 worlds before being assigned to Earth, was writing reports that grew longer and more frustrated with each passing week. The infrastructure projects kept failing. Roads the Dominion repaired were sabotaged within days. Power grids they restored went dark without explanation. Communication towers they erected developed mysterious faults that no technician could diagnose. A mining survey team sent to evaluate mineral deposits in Australia went into the outback and came back 3 days later, missing all their equipment. They reported that it had simply vanished overnight while they slept, despite the fact that they had posted guards. In Manchester, a patrol mech, a 12-foot armored machine that walked on 4 legs and carried enough firepower to level a building, was found disabled in the middle of the street, with no signs of damage. The Dominion engineers who examined it discovered that someone had managed to access its external maintenance panel, a panel that required 6 separate security codes to open, and had simply disconnected a single wire. The mech's internal logs showed that it had been standing motionless for 16 hours before anyone noticed. These were not accidents. These were messages. My cell was responsible for some of them, but not most. That was the beautiful thing. Across the planet, hundreds of cells were operating independently, each one inventing its own methods, its own tools, its own small rebellions. A group in Buenos Aires figured out how to redirect Dominion supply shipments to empty warehouses. A team in Seoul built a device that could mimic Dominion patrol signals, sending entire squads on wild chases through abandoned neighborhoods. Someone in Nairobi, and we never did find out who, managed to hack the Dominion's propaganda broadcast system and replace the governor's latest speech with 3 hours of a song about a duck that had gone viral on the internet before the invasion. The Dominion did not understand the duck song. They spent 2 days analyzing it for hidden messages. I learned all of this through the network, the fragile web of communication that connected the resistance cells through encrypted signals bounced off deactivated satellites and hidden relay stations. We could not communicate freely. Every message was a risk, but the information that trickled through painted a picture that made me smile every time I saw it. The Dominion was not losing, but they were not winning either, and for an empire that had never experienced anything less than total, efficient, immediate victory, the distinction was maddening. It was during this time that I made contact with Torek. Torek was a Felirathi, one of a species of traders who operated throughout Dominion space. The Felirathi were small, quick, covered in short golden fur, with sharp eyes and sharper minds. They had been conquered by the Dominion 3 centuries ago and had adapted by making themselves useful. They ran trade routes, brokered deals, and moved goods across interstellar distances with a reliability that the Dominion valued too much to interfere with. Torek was not a rebel. He was not a hero. He was a businessman who had been running a supply route through the Sol system when the invasion happened, and had been stuck in orbit ever since, waiting for the Dominion to open Earth's ports for commerce. He was bored, annoyed, and looking for opportunities. I found him through Oliver, who had intercepted a Felirathi trade frequency and spent 2 weeks establishing contact. Torek agreed to meet with me not because he supported the resistance, but because he wanted to sell us things. He had a cargo hold full of medical supplies and water purification units that the Dominion was not going to buy, and he saw no reason not to make a profit off the local population. Our first meeting was in the basement of a collapsed parking structure in South London. Torek arrived in a small shuttle that he had somehow managed to land without triggering Dominion sensors, a fact that told me more about the gaps in the Dominion surveillance network than any intelligence report ever had. He was smaller than I expected. The top of his head reached my chin. His golden fur was streaked with gray around the muzzle, and his eyes moved constantly, cataloging everything they saw. He looked at me, at Oliver standing behind me with a modified stun weapon, at the crumbling concrete around us, and his first words were, "You people are in terrible condition. I can offer a bulk discount." I liked him immediately. We made a deal. Medical supplies and water filters in exchange for salvaged Dominion components that Torek could resell in other systems. It was simple commerce, and it kept both of us alive. But over the following weeks, as Torek made regular supply runs to our tunnel network, something else developed. Not friendship exactly. Torek did not believe in friendship as a concept. He believed in mutually beneficial relationships, which he said was the same thing but more honest. It was Torek who told me the truth about what the Dominion was telling the galaxy. He showed me on a small display screen in his shuttle, scrolling through galactic infonet feeds from dozens of species. Every single one carried the same story. Earth had been pacified, humanity had submitted. The Dominion's conquest was complete, efficient, and total, just like every other conquest in their history. Resource extraction was proceeding on schedule. There was nothing to see. "They are lying," I said. Torek gave me a look that suggested I had stated something so obvious it barely deserved acknowledgement. Of course they are lying. They always lie. The difference is that this time, the lie matters. He explained it to me as a business problem, because that was how Torek understood everything. The Dominion's power was not just military, it was economic and psychological. Every conquered species in their empire accepted their subjugation, because they believed resistance was pointless. The Dominion always won. Everyone knew it. Why fight an enemy you cannot defeat? But if the galaxy learned that a species was fighting back, actually fighting back and causing real problems, that story would be worth more than any weapon. Because the Dominion's greatest asset was not their fleet. It was the belief that their fleet was unbeatable. And beliefs, as Torek pointed out with a merchant's understanding of market forces, are fragile things. You do not need to defeat them, he said, leaning forward in his pilot's seat, with his sharp eyes fixed on mine. You need to be seen fighting them. The story is the weapon. I thought about that for a long time. It was 3 weeks later that Torek asked me the question. We were sitting in his shuttle, drinking something he called a trade deal closer, which tasted like warm honey mixed with battery acid. He had been watching me review supply lists, and he set down his cup and said, "I have to know, why do you keep fighting?" "Because we have not lost," I said. "You have lost," he said, not unkindly. "By every calculation, by every historical precedent, by every measure that matters, you have lost. Your cities are rubble. Your armies are gone. You live in holes beneath the ground. The Dominion controls your planet, your resources, and your future. You have lost. So why?" I put down the supply list and looked at him. He was genuinely asking. In 3 centuries of Dominion rule, the Felirathi had never produced a resistance movement. Not because they were cowards, but because they were rational. They had weighed the odds, accepted the outcome, and adapted. It was the sensible thing to do. "Torek," I said, "every other species the Dominion conquered was smart enough to do the math and give up. Every single one looked at the numbers and made the rational choice." "Yes," he said, "that is how intelligent beings behave." "Well," I said, "lucky for us, we are not that smart." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he made a sound that I had learned was the Felirathi equivalent of a disbelieving laugh. "You are serious." "Completely. Humans do not calculate whether to fight. We just fight. There is something in us, something unreasonable, that every rational species in the galaxy bred out of themselves a long time ago. Stubbornness, defiance, the willingness to keep going even when every logical part of our brain is telling us to stop. We will set ourselves on fire to prove a point. We will argue with a storm. We will look at an empire that controls 400 star systems and say, "No, not today, not ever, not us." Torek was quiet for a while. Then he said, "That is either the most inspiring or the most terrifying thing I have ever heard." "It can be both," I said. The operation we called Black Noise came together over the following month. It was our most ambitious plan since the surrender, and it required coordination between 12 cells across 6 continents. The goal was not to destroy the Dominion's forces. We did not have the strength for that, not yet. The goal was to do exactly what Torek had suggested: be seen. The Dominion's communication relay network on Earth consisted of 48 towers spread across the globe. These towers connected Dominion forces on the ground to their fleet in orbit, and, crucially, to the broader galactic infonet. They were heavily guarded and deeply shielded, and attacking them was supposed to be impossible. We did not attack all 48. We targeted 6, one on each inhabited continent, and we hit them simultaneously. Cell 7's target was the relay tower in Regent's Park. The Dominion had built it right in the center of the park, a spire of dark metal that rose 200 feet into the London sky like a needle, stitching the city to the stars. It was guarded by a full patrol squad and ringed with sensor fields that could detect a mouse at 50 meters. Priya broke their sensor codes in 3 days. She sat cross-legged on a tunnel floor, with a salvaged Dominion data tablet balanced on her knees, and worked through the encryption with a focus that made the rest of us afraid to breathe too loudly. When she finished, she looked up and said, "The sensors have a refresh cycle of 4.7 seconds. That is your window." 4.7 seconds. To cross 50 meters of open ground, plant a transmitter on the tower's broadcast array, and get out before the sensors came back online. "That is not enough time," Daniel said. "Then be fast," Priya said. I picked Sophie for the run, not because she was the fastest, though she was close, but because she had a quality that mattered more than speed. She was calm, unshakably, impossibly calm. I had once seen her defuse a Dominion stun mine while telling a joke about a plumber, and she had not missed a beat on either the mine or the punchline. At 2:14 in the morning on a cold November night, Sophie Langford, former geography teacher, mother of 2, current resistance operative, sprinted across the frozen grass of Regent's Park in complete darkness. She had 4.7 seconds, and she used 4.3 of them. The transmitter locked onto the tower's broadcast array with a magnetic clamp, and Sophie rolled behind a maintenance shed as the sensors came back online. The transmitter activated and began broadcasting. Across the world, 5 other transmitters did the same. For 30 seconds, every Dominion relay on Earth carried the same signal, a signal that was pushed through the network and out into the galactic infonet before anyone could stop it. 30 seconds of footage, shot on a handheld camera by a resistance fighter in Buenos Aires. It showed a group of humans standing in the ruins of what had once been a shopping district. They were dirty and tired, and armed with weapons made from scrap metal and determination. And at the center of the frame, quite by accident, was me. I had been visiting the Buenos Aires cell 2 weeks earlier, when the footage was shot, and I had not known anyone was recording. In the video, I was standing in front of a burning relay tower, my face streaked with grime, and I was giving the camera a thumbs up. That was it. 30 seconds. No speeches, no declarations. Just humans, standing in rubble, very much alive, and very much not pacified. The Dominion's response was immediate and harsh. They locked down entire districts. They doubled patrols. They made examples. Governor Dreth Saran broadcast a warning that any further acts of rebellion would be met with severe consequences. The relay towers were reinforced. New security protocols were implemented. Everything the Dominion did, they did with the confidence of an empire that had dealt with minor inconveniences before. But the damage was already done. Across the galaxy, on worlds and stations and ships, beings of 100 different species watched a 30-second clip of battered, exhausted, unbroken humans standing in the wreckage of a world they were supposed to have lost. And for many of them, it was the first time they had ever seen anyone stand up after the Dominion knocked them down. Torek sent me a message that night. It was short. "You have no idea what you have just started." I smiled when I read it. Then I went back to work. Because the truth was, I did know, and we were only getting started. The morning after Black Noise, I woke up to the sound of Dominion gunships passing overhead, low and fast and angry. The vibration shook dust from the tunnel ceiling, and I lay on my mattress and counted them. 14. They had never sent more than 6 on a standard patrol. I smiled at the ceiling and thought, good morning to you too. 6 months had passed since the invasion, and something fundamental had shifted. It was not just us, it was them. The Dominion had arrived on Earth with the practiced confidence of an empire that had done this 100 times before. Now they moved with the tense, watchful energy of an occupier who had realized, too late, that the ground beneath their feet was not as stable as they had assumed. I saw it in their numbers. Torek, who had access to Dominion logistics channels through his trade network, showed me the figures one evening in his shuttle. The Dominion had now deployed more troops to Earth than they had used to conquer their last 3 worlds combined. 3 entire planets, each with their own civilizations, their own militaries, their own defenses, had required fewer soldiers than a single species that was supposedly already defeated. "Your governor is requesting reinforcements again," Torek said, scrolling through the data. "That is the 4th time this month. Central Command is getting annoyed." "Good," I said. "No, not good. Annoyed empires do stupid things." He paused. "But also, yes, good." The reinforcements came, and with them came a new strategy. The Dominion's military commanders had finally accepted that the standard pacification playbook was not working. They brought in specialists, officers who had dealt with insurgencies before, though none had dealt with anything quite like this. The new commander, a Valith general named Calith Vor, ordered a complete restructuring of the occupation force, smaller, faster patrol units, predictive mapping of resistance activity, a network of informants recruited from the local population. It was a sound strategy. It might have worked against a resistance movement with a structure he could map and predict. It did not work against us. The reason was something I had started calling the fracture doctrine, though I had not invented it. Nobody had. It was simply what humanity did when it was pushed into a corner. We broke apart, not in defeat, but in adaptation. Every cell on Earth was independent. We shared information when we could, coordinated operations when the opportunity arose, but each cell made its own decisions, chose its own targets, invented its own methods. There was no chain of command for the Dominion to trace, no central leadership to capture, no single point of failure. When General Calith Vor's intelligence teams captured a cell leader in Prague, they interrogated her for weeks. Her name was Grace Holloway, and she had run Cell 19 with a creativity that had driven the Dominion's local garrison to the edge of sanity. They asked her about the command structure. She told them the truth. There was no command structure. They asked her who gave the orders. She told them the truth again. Nobody gave the orders. They did not believe her. They could not believe her. In 10,000 years, the Dominion had never encountered an enemy that operated without a hierarchy. The concept was so foreign to their understanding of how civilizations worked that they literally could not process it. A frustrated report from one of Calith Vor's intelligence officers was intercepted by a cell in Cairo. It contained a line that I had printed out and pinned to the wall of my tunnel. It said, "Fighting the humans is like fighting a river. You can block one channel, and the water simply finds another path." I loved that line. I thought it was the most accurate thing any Dominion officer had ever written. While the Dominion was struggling to understand our structure, we were doing something they found far more alarming. We were learning. Humans have many qualities that other species find strange or unsettling, but the one that frightened the Dominion the most was our speed of adaptation. We did not just resist, we evolved. Every piece of Dominion technology we captured was taken apart, studied, and understood within weeks. Then, it was rebuilt. Then it was improved. Oliver Grant led our cell's engineering team, and watching him work was like watching a man have a conversation with the universe. He would sit with a piece of Dominion equipment, turning it over in his huge hands, and you could almost see the understanding assembling itself behind his eyes. A Dominion plasma weapon that had taken the Felirathi 80 years to partially replicate was disassembled and rebuilt by Oliver's team in 4 months. Not only did they replicate it, they improved the cooling system, increasing its operational time by 40%. In Lagos, a cell led by a former telecommunications engineer named Nora Fields built a device that could disrupt Dominion shielding frequencies using components salvaged from an automobile and a household appliance. The device was crude, unreliable, and had to be rebuilt after every use. It also worked, which was the only thing that mattered. In Tokyo, a team of software engineers who had been working for a gaming company before the invasion developed a program that could predict Dominion patrol patterns with 72% accuracy. They ran it on a server they had hidden in the basement of a ramen shop. The Dominion's chief scientist, a being whose name I could not pronounce but whose reports I read with great interest, sent a classified assessment to Emperor Zareth Cole that was intercepted by Priya's decryption network. It said, "They are not inventing. They are evolving. It is not the same thing, and it is far more dangerous." I read that report to my cell over a dinner of reheated rations, and Daniel Perry raised his tin cup in a toast. "To being dangerous," he said. "To being dangerous," we echoed. But it was not all victories and clever tricks. I need to be honest about that. The Dominion was vast and powerful and ruthless, and for every success we achieved, there was a cost. Supply shortages were constant. Medical care was primitive. We lost people, not in dramatic final stands, but in the quiet, grinding way that resistance always claims its own. Infections that could not be treated, injuries that could not be healed, the slow erosion of hope that comes from living underground in the dark, fighting an enemy that controls the sky. And then there were the operations that failed. Cell 12 in Jakarta attempted to sabotage a Dominion fuel depot and was detected before they could reach the perimeter. The Dominion captured 8 of their members. We never heard from them again. Cell 23 in Toronto lost their entire communications array to a random Dominion sweep. They went silent for 3 weeks before we re-established contact and found that they had been operating completely blind, continuing their sabotage operations with no intelligence, no coordination, and no support, simply because stopping had not occurred to them as an option. And in my own cell, the loss hit closer than I ever wanted it to. It was a Thursday. I remember that because Thursdays were when Priya did her weekly decryption reviews, sitting in her corner of the tunnel with her tablet and her fierce concentration and the thermos of tea that Claire Ashton, our medic, always made for her. Priya had become the heartbeat of our cell. Her decryption work gave us eyes into the Dominion's operations that no other cell had. She was 16 years old and she was winning an intelligence war against an empire. The Dominion traced one of our signal intercepts, not to our tunnel but close enough. They swept the area with ground teams and sensor drones, and Priya's decryption station, which she had set up in a maintenance room 200 meters from our main tunnel, was directly in their path. We had 90 seconds of warning. Daniel spotted the sensor drones on our perimeter monitors and sounded the alert. I ordered an immediate evacuation of the secondary tunnels. Most of our people made it back to the main network in time. Priya did not. She was with Simon Drake, our intelligence coordinator, in the decryption room when the Dominion team cut through the door. Simon managed to destroy the primary data stores before they entered. He and Priya were captured trying to reach the escape tunnel. I stood at the sealed door of the main tunnel and listened to the sounds of the Dominion team moving through the corridors on the other side, and I made the hardest decision of my life. I did not open the door. I did not launch a rescue. I kept 60 people safe, and I left 2 behind, and I have carried the weight of that choice every day since. Simon was 41. He had been a communications officer in the Royal Navy. He had a dry sense of humor and a talent for crossword puzzles, and he made the best tea I had ever tasted. Priya was 16. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the main tunnel with my back against the wall, and I stared at the ceiling, and I let the grief wash through me. Claire sat beside me for a while without speaking. Daniel brought me tea that was not as good as Simon's, and said nothing. Sophie checked the perimeter monitors with a calm efficiency that I knew was masking her own pain. In the small hours of the morning, when the tunnel was quiet and most of my people were sleeping the restless sleep of the hunted, I opened Priya's backup files on a secondary tablet she had left in my care. She had been working on a Dominion logistics analysis when she was taken. The file was still open, the data still arranged in the precise, elegant patterns that only Priya could create. She had been tracking Dominion supply shipments to Earth. The numbers were remarkable. In 6 months, the Dominion had tripled their supply flow to maintain the occupation. Tripled. They were burning through resources at a rate that would have been unsustainable for a small empire, let alone a sector of a large one. At the bottom of the spreadsheet, in a margin where analysts sometimes left notes, Priya had written a single line in her small, neat handwriting. "We are expensive. That is winning." I read it 4 times. Then I closed the tablet, pressed it against my chest, and allowed myself a small, broken smile in the darkness. The next morning, I called a meeting of my senior people. Daniel, Sophie, Oliver, Claire, and Lucy Bennett, our communications specialist who had stepped into the gap left by Simon's absence, with a quiet determination that I admired more than I could express. I told them about Priya's analysis. I told them what it meant, and then I told them about the plan that had been forming in the back of my mind since the day of the invasion, the plan that I was now ready to put into action. I called it Operation Lazarus. The concept was not a single battle. We could not win a single battle against the Dominion. Not yet, possibly not ever. Instead, Lazarus was a cascading series of operations designed to achieve one very specific goal. We were going to make Earth so expensive to hold that the Dominion would choose to leave. Not defeat them, bankrupt them, turn their conquest into a money pit so deep that even an empire of 400 star systems could not afford to keep filling it. That is either brilliant or insane, Daniel said when I finished explaining. It is both, I said. That is kind of our thing. I reached out through the network to every cell I could contact. The message was simple. Phase 1 of Lazarus was about to begin. And the thing about long, grinding, unwinnable wars? We wrote the book on those. 9 months since the invasion. I had started keeping a calendar on the tunnel wall, scratching marks into the concrete with a piece of rebar, and the rows of lines had grown long enough that they curved around the corner and continued down the adjacent wall. Each mark was a day survived. Each mark was a small rebellion against the empire that had declared us finished. Phase 1 of Operation Lazarus began on a Monday, because even the resistance needed to start the week with a purpose. The strategy was designed around a single, devastating truth that Priya's analysis had revealed. The Dominion did not occupy planets for ideological reasons. They were not crusaders or missionaries. They were accountants. Every conquest in their history had been justified by a simple equation. The cost of taking and holding a world had to be less than the value of the resources extracted from it. For 10,000 years, that equation had always balanced in their favor. We were going to break the equation. Phase 1 targeted the Dominion's extraction operations. Every mine, every refinery, every transport route, every processing facility they had established on Earth became a target. Not for destruction, that would have required firepower we did not have, but for disruption. Constant, relentless, maddening disruption. In the Australian outback, a cell led by a former mining engineer named Henry Cole developed a technique for introducing microscopic contaminants into ore samples that made them unusable but were undetectable by Dominion scanning equipment until the ore had already been processed and shipped. 3 entire cargo loads were rejected at the Dominion's orbital processing station before they figured out what was happening. In South America, cells coordinated to sabotage transport routes in rotating patterns. They would hit a road one week, wait for the Dominion to repair and secure it, then hit a completely different road the next week. The Dominion could not guard every route simultaneously, and the constant disruption reduced their transport efficiency by nearly half. In Scandinavia, a team of marine biologists who had been studying Arctic ecosystems before the invasion figured out how to interfere with the Dominion's deep-sea mining drones by mimicking the acoustic signatures of large ocean creatures. The drones were programmed to avoid local fauna to prevent ecological data corruption, and they spent more time dodging phantom signals than actually mining. It was beautiful. Not in any grand or dramatic way, but in the quiet, methodical way that 1,000 small actions can combine into something unstoppable. Each individual act of sabotage was minor. A delayed shipment here, a contaminated sample there, a transport route that had to be rerouted, a facility that had to be shut down for inspection. None of it was enough to matter on its own. Together, it was enough to make the numbers stop working. Torek brought me the financial data 4 months into Phase 1. He spread it across his shuttle's display with the satisfied air of a merchant who had just spotted a market crash he could profit from. The cost of the Earth occupation has exceeded the projected resource yield by a factor of 3, he said, tapping the numbers. The sector governor has filed 9 budget overrun reports. Central Command has denied his last 2 requests for additional funding. The Dominion Senate's Finance Committee has opened a review. A review, I repeated. In Dominion politics, a review is a polite word for panic, Torek said. They have never had a conquest that lost money. They do not have procedures for it. The bureaucrats are going insane. I sat back in my seat and let that sink in. We were not beating the Dominion with superior weapons or tactics. We were beating them with accounting. But Phase 1 was only the beginning. Phase 2 was where things got interesting. Phase 2 was the diplomatic front, and it required something I had never done before. I had to stop being a tunnel rat and start being a politician. Through Toric's network, through the fragile web of sympathetic traders and discontented species that had been growing since the Black Noise broadcast, we arranged a meeting. Not a military summit, not a war council, a conversation. 12 species sent representatives. They came in secret, through back channels and hidden trade routes, to a Felarathi cargo station in neutral space. I could not attend in person, obviously. Instead, I appeared as a holographic projection transmitted through a chain of relay stations that bounced the signal across 3 star systems. I looked at the faces on the screen. 12 species, each one conquered or cowed by the Dominion at some point in their history, each one living under the Empire's shadow, not because they wanted to, but because they believed they had no choice. I did not beg for help. I did not make emotional appeals. I showed them numbers. I showed them the cost of the Earth occupation. I showed them the Dominion's overextended supply lines. I showed them the internal political fractures that were widening with every passing month. I showed them the financial data that Toric had gathered, the budget reports, the denied funding requests, the Senate review. And then I said something that Toric had coached me on for weeks, something calculated to hit every representative in the room exactly where it mattered most. "We are not asking you to save us," I said. "We do not need saving. We are showing you the door we kicked open. Walk through it, or do not. That is your choice. But know this. The Dominion's power has always been the belief that they cannot be challenged. We have proven that they can. The question is not whether that belief will break. It will. The question is whether you will be ready when it does." Silence. A long, thick silence that stretched across light years of space and touched every being in that room. Then the Rithani representative, a tall, gray-skinned being whose species had been conquered 600 years ago, leaned forward and said, "Tell us about your supply needs." 5 species committed to covert support that day. 2 of them, the Rithani and the Ul Kavari, announced within weeks that they were beginning their own resistance movements. The Dominion, already stretched thin on Earth, suddenly had 3 fires to manage. But Phase 3 was the masterstroke, and Phase 3 was mine. For months, my intelligence teams had been feeding the Dominion false information. Carefully, patiently, through channels we knew were monitored, we had built a fiction. We let slip references to a central command. We mentioned a hidden bunker where the resistance leadership met. We dropped coordinates, buried in encrypted messages that were just slightly too easy to decrypt, pointing to a location deep in the Swiss Alps. The Dominion took the bait. Of course they did. Their entire strategic framework was built on the assumption that every enemy had a command center, a head that could be cut off. They had been searching for ours since the occupation began. The idea that we did not have one was so alien to their thinking that they would rather believe we were hiding it than accept that it did not exist. General Caliph Vor committed an enormous strike force to the assault. Troop carriers, gunships, infantry, special operations units, everything he could spare. The operation was planned with meticulous Dominion precision. They would hit the bunker fast and hard, capture the resistance leadership, and end the insurgency in a single decisive blow. They found the bunker. It was real. We had spent 3 months preparing it, carving it out of the mountain rock, installing lighting and ventilation and communication equipment, and even a conference table, because details mattered. It looked exactly like a command center should look. It was completely empty. The Dominion strike force moved through the bunker room by room, corridor by corridor, and found nothing. No people. No equipment that was not bolted to the walls. No intelligence. Nothing. Nothing except a single table in the main chamber, and on that table, a handwritten note in English. Not even close. But the note was not the trap was what happened next. The moment the first Dominion soldier entered the bunker, every transmitter we had hidden in the walls, the ceiling, the floors, the ventilation system, activated simultaneously. Cameras, microphones, and sensors linked to a broadcast system that Priya had designed before she was taken. A system that Lucy Bennett had spent months perfecting and connecting to the Galactic Infonet through a relay chain that could not be shut down in time. The entire assault was broadcast live. Every species on the infonet watched the Dominion's most feared soldiers storm an empty room. They watched General Caliph Vor's strike force, the pride of the occupation army, standing in a hollow mountain reading a piece of paper. They watched the most powerful military in the galaxy get outsmarted by people who lived in tunnels and built weapons from salvaged parts, and refused, against all reason and evidence, to give up. The broadcast lasted 11 minutes before the Dominion managed to shut it down. 11 minutes was enough. More than enough. Emperor Zareth Cole IV addressed the galaxy within hours. His broadcast was furious and barely controlled. He declared humanity a galactic threat. He called us vermin, parasites, a species that refused to accept its natural place in the order of things. He threatened total annihilation. But the cracks were already showing. 3 member species formally withdrew their support for the Earth occupation within days of his broadcast. The Dominion Senate, which had been questioning the campaign for months, now openly challenged the Emperor's strategy. Financial markets across the Empire wobbled as investors began to doubt the stability of a regime that could be humiliated by a conquered species on a live broadcast. I sat in my tunnel that night, and I did something I had not done in months. I laughed. Not because we had won. We had not. The Dominion was still on Earth. Their ships still filled the sky. Their soldiers still patrolled the streets. The danger was arguably greater than ever, because a wounded empire is a dangerous empire, and we had just wounded their pride, which was the deepest wound of all. I laughed because a year ago, the galaxy had written humanity's obituary. They had sent condolences and filed us under extinct and moved on with their lives. And tonight, the empire that controlled 400 star systems, the empire that had conquered civilizations for 10,000 years, the empire that had never known anything but total victory, was afraid of us. I pulled out my journal and wrote by the light of a salvaged lamp. They came here to conquer a planet. They did not realize they picked a fight with a species that invented stubbornness as an art form. 14 months since the invasion, and the sky above London was quiet. I noticed it before I was fully awake, lying on my mattress in the tunnel with my eyes still closed, and my mind doing the automatic threat assessment that had become as natural as breathing. Something was different. The low, constant hum of Dominion gunship engines that had been the background noise of my life for over a year was gone. Not reduced. Gone. I opened my eyes. The tunnel ceiling stared back at me, the same cracked concrete I had been staring at for 427 days. But the silence above was new. I found Lucy at her communications station, her headphones half on, her expression a mixture of confusion and cautious hope. "Patrols are down to a third of normal levels," she said before I could ask. "Supply ship arrivals have dropped by half, and I am picking up a lot of encrypted chatter on Dominion military frequencies. A lot of it. What kind of chatter?" "The kind that sounds like people arguing about who gets to leave first." I sat down next to her and listened. The Dominion was not retreating, not yet, but they were pulling back, consolidating, thinning their presence in areas they had once flooded with troops. It was subtle enough that most people on the surface would not have noticed, but I had spent 14 months learning to read the Dominion's body language through their communications, and what I was reading now made my heart beat faster than any battle ever had. They were hesitating. The Valith Dominion, 10,000 years of unbroken conquest, 400 star systems, countless subjugated species, had never hesitated in their entire history. Hesitation was for lesser civilizations. The Dominion moved with the absolute certainty of a force that knew it could not be stopped. Until now. The intelligence that flowed through our networks over the following days painted a picture that I would have called impossible a year ago. 3 of the Dominion's founding species, the oldest and most powerful members of the Empire, had issued a joint declaration to the Imperial Senate. The Earth campaign, they said, was a strategic failure. The cost had exceeded all projections. The resistance showed no signs of diminishing, and the political fallout, the humiliation of the bunker broadcast, the defection of member species, the economic instability, was causing damage to the Empire that far outweighed any resources Earth could provide. They demanded withdrawal. Emperor Zareth Cole refused. Of course he refused. He had staked his reputation, his dynasty, his legacy on the conquest of Earth. Withdrawal would mean admitting that for the first time in Dominion history, A conquered species had won, not through superior firepower, not through advanced technology, through sheer, unreasonable, impossible determination. But Zareth Kol was no longer the power he had been. The Imperial Senate, which had rubber-stamped his decisions for decades, was now a battleground. Factions that had been silent for generations were finding their voices. The Military Council, which had prosecuted the Earth campaign with professional efficiency, was now openly leaking classified assessments to senators who wanted ammunition against the Emperor. Torek brought me one of those assessments. He handed it to me in his shuttle, with the air of someone presenting a gift they knew was priceless. It was a military projection, compiled by the Dominion Strategic Planning Division, classified at the highest level. It estimated that full pacification of Earth, the complete and total suppression of all resistance activity, would require 60 more years and 4 times the current resource commitment. 60 years, 4 times the resources, an expenditure so vast that it would destabilize the Dominion's economy across multiple sectors. Attached to the report was a personal note from a Dominion admiral, whose name I had seen on dozens of intercepted communications over the past year. He was the commander of the orbital fleet, the man whose ships had darkened our skies, and his note was addressed to his wife. It said, "We did not conquer Earth. Earth is conquering us. It is doing so by making us spend ourselves into nothing against people who fight with salvaged parts and repurposed machines and refuse, by every force in the universe, to stop. I do not know how to defeat an enemy that does not know when it has lost, because the answer may be that you cannot." I read that note 3 times. Then I folded it carefully and placed it next to the other piece of paper I kept in my vest pocket, the original Dominion communique that had declared pacification complete. 2 pieces of paper, one from the beginning, one from the end. The distance between them measured in 14 months, in thousands of lives, in the kind of suffering that no story can fully capture, but also in something else, something that the Dominion, in all their centuries of conquest, had never seen before. A species that simply would not stop. The ripple effects were spreading faster than even I had anticipated. The Rathani revolt had grown from scattered protests into a full-scale resistance movement that was tying down 3 Dominion garrison fleets. The Ul Kavari had launched an economic boycott that was disrupting trade routes across an entire sector. And Torek's people, the Felirathi, the cautious, rational, profit-driven Felirathi, had done something that shocked the galaxy. They cut trade ties with the Dominion. Torek told me about it himself, sitting in his shuttle with an expression that mixed disbelief with something I had never seen on his face before. Pride. "The Trade Council voted this morning," he said. "Unanimous. We are severing all commercial relationships with the Valeth Dominion, effective immediately." "Torek," I said, "that is enormous." "It is insane," he said. "The Dominion is our largest trading partner. This will cost us billions. The Trade Council does not make decisions that cost billions. They make decisions that earn billions. This is not rational." "Then why did they do it?" He looked at me for a long moment. "Because of you. Because of what you showed us. Because a species that everyone wrote off as finished stood up in the ruins and refused to fall back down, and watching it change something in every other species that was watching." He paused. "You taught us something, Elise. Something we had forgotten. That there are things worth more than profit." I did not know what to say to that, so I reached out and took his small, furred hand, and I held it, and we sat together in silence, while the universe rearranged itself around us. The end, when it came, was not dramatic. There was no final battle, no last stand, no moment of cinematic triumph. What happened was quieter than that, and in some ways, more powerful. Emperor Zareth Kol IV was removed from power by his own Senate. Not in a violent uprising, but in a procedural vote. A motion of no confidence, passed by a 2/3 majority, stripped him of his authority, and placed the empire under senatorial control. The new Senate leadership immediately opened negotiations with the human resistance. I conducted those negotiations from my tunnel. Lucy set up a communication link to the Dominion's diplomatic channel, and I sat at a folding table surrounded by concrete walls and exposed wiring, and spoke to the representatives of a galactic empire about the terms of their withdrawal. The terms were not generous. They were not meant to be. Full withdrawal of all Dominion forces from Earth. Recognition of human sovereignty. Reparations for damages. And a formal apology, broadcast across the Galactic Infonet, for the invasion and occupation of a sovereign world. The Dominion negotiators argued. They pushed back. They tried to soften the terms. But they were negotiating from a position they had never occupied before. A position of weakness. And they knew it. And I knew it. And that knowledge sat between us like a wall they could not climb. The withdrawal began on a Tuesday. I climbed out of my tunnel for the first time in weeks, and stood on a rooftop in South London, and watched the Dominion transports lift off, one by one, rising into a sky that was gray and heavy with clouds. Each ship that left took a piece of the occupation with it. Each gap in the formation was a small victory. The last transport lifted off from Trafalgar Square. I was not there to see it in person, but Sophie was, and she described it to me later. The plaza was scarred and cracked, the old column still standing but surrounded by rubble, and as the transport's engines fired and it rose into the air, a small group of people who had gathered to watch began to clap. Not cheering, not screaming, just clapping, slowly and steadily, the way you might applaud at the end of something long and difficult and hard-earned. In the days that followed, I walked through London, not as a resistance commander, not as a soldier, just as a person, moving through the streets of a city that had survived the worst thing that had ever happened to it. It was not pretty. The city was damaged, scarred, broken in ways that would take years to repair. Entire neighborhoods were rubble. Infrastructure was shattered. The marks of the occupation were everywhere, in the craters, in the burned buildings, in the empty spaces where landmarks had once stood. But it was alive. That was the thing that hit me hardest, harder than any battle, harder than any victory. London was alive, and it was already rebuilding. I passed a street corner, where a man had set up a cart, and was selling tea from a battered metal urn. The cart was made from salvaged wood, and the cups were mismatched. And he was doing steady business because people still needed tea, and people still needed something normal in the midst of everything abnormal. I passed a group of engineers arguing loudly over a set of blueprints spread across the hood of a car. They were planning the rebuilding of a hospital, and they could not agree on where the main entrance should face, and their argument was so passionate and so wonderfully petty that I stopped and listened for 5 minutes just to hear human beings arguing about something that was not survival. I passed children playing in the remains of a park, kicking a ball made of taped-together scraps across ground that was more dirt than grass. They were laughing. The sound of it stopped me in my tracks because I realized I had not heard a child laugh in 14 months, and I had forgotten what it sounded like. This was what the Dominion never understood. This was the thing that broke their models and crashed their simulations, and drove their analysts to confusion. We did not fight because we thought we could win. We fought because fighting was what we did, because giving up was a concept that we understood intellectually, but had never quite managed to internalize as a species, because somewhere in the strange, messy, contradictory code of human nature, there was a line that said, when everything falls apart, get up and make tea, and argue about hospital entrances, and kick a ball around and start again. We did not need to win to keep going. We just needed each other. 2 weeks after the withdrawal, I was asked to address the galaxy. The newly formed Human Diplomatic Council, a temporary body assembled from resistance leaders and surviving government officials, wanted someone to deliver a formal statement, an introduction of humanity to the interstellar community, now as a free and recognized species. They asked me because of the video, that 30-second clip from Black Noise, the one where I stood in front of a burning relay tower and gave a thumbs up, had become the most viewed piece of media in galactic history. I had become a symbol, which was uncomfortable and slightly ridiculous because I was a woman who had spent the last year living in a subway tunnel and eating food from dented cans. I spent 3 days writing the speech. I wrote something grand and diplomatic, full of references to galactic cooperation and mutual respect, and the promise of a shared future. It was good. It was polished. It was exactly the kind of thing a representative of a newly recognized species should say. I threw it away 5 minutes before the broadcast. Instead, I stood in front of a camera in a room that still smelled like concrete dust, wearing the same jacket I had worn in the tunnels because I had not had time to find anything else, and I spoke from something deeper than diplomacy. My name is Elisa Vargon, I said. I am speaking to you on behalf of the people of Earth. We are a species that most of you have never met, and what you know about us comes from a war that none of us wanted. So let me tell you who we are. We are the people who said no. When an empire that had never been challenged told us to kneel, we said no. When every rational calculation told us we had already lost, we said no. When the cost of fighting was higher than anyone should have to pay, we said no. Not because we could not count, not because we did not understand the odds, but because there is something in us, something stubborn and unreasonable, and absolutely unwilling to accept that the story is over, just because someone else decided it should be. You all watched us during the occupation. Most of you looked away. Some of you helped. We will remember both, not with anger, but with clarity. We understand why you looked away. The Dominion was powerful, and fear is rational. But we will remember those who reached out, when reaching out, could have cost them everything. The Rathani, the Ul-Kavari, the Felarathi, and others who sent help in ways we may never fully know. We are not here to threaten anyone. We are not here to build an empire. We have seen what empires do, and we want no part of it. We are here to live, to rebuild, to explore, to argue about things that do not matter, and fight for things that do. We are here to be what we have always been, a loud, messy, stubborn, beautiful species that does not know when to quit. And if anyone ever looks at our world again and thinks we are an easy target, if anyone ever points their ships at our sky and tells us to surrender, if anyone ever assumes that because we are small and young and new to this vast universe, we will break. I paused. I looked directly into the camera, and I smiled. Not even close. The broadcast ended. The room was quiet. Sophie, who had been standing behind the camera, wiped her eyes and said nothing. Daniel, who had been watching from the doorway, raised his cup and nodded. Lucy switched off the equipment and let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for a year. I stayed in the room for a while after everyone left. I pulled 2 pieces of paper from my vest pocket. The first was the Dominion communique from the beginning, the one that said, "Pacification of Earth, complete." The second was the Admiral's note, the one that said we were conquering them by refusing to stop. I pinned them both to the wall. Then I pulled a marker from my pocket and wrote a single word beneath them. Incorrect. I looked at it for a moment. Then I put the cap on the marker, turned off the light, and walked out of the room and up the stairs and through the corridor and out into the open air. The sun was setting over London. The sky was orange and purple and streaked with clouds, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Not because it was extraordinary, but because I was standing under it, alive, free, and looking up at a sky that no longer belonged to anyone but us. Behind me, the tunnel. 14 months of darkness and determination and loss, and the kind of hope that only exists when everything else has been stripped away. Ahead of me, everything else. I took a breath, I took a step, and I walked into whatever came next, the way humans always have, with no guarantee of what we would find but an absolute refusal to stop looking for it.